Does what's going on right now with the coronavirus have anything to do with prophecy? I think the quick answer is no, it doesn't. And that may surprise you. But let's look at a few scriptures today that show how bad it's actually going to be in the very end, and how what's going on, even in worst case scenario, what's going on does not compare with what is to come. In Revelation 6, it talks about the first four seals, and those are the ones we're going to talk about because it talks about the first six. But in the first four seals, and we talked about the first one in a previous program, that of false religion, but the second, third, and fourth are war, famine, and pestilence. And we see that these riders come on the scene one after the other. And for me, the way I envision it is that you have a scroll. And on the scroll, there are seven seals. And you open up the first seal, as I say you, it's Christ is the one that has been given the authority to do that. You open up the first seal and you see the first rider or the first event happen. And then you open up the second seal and the second rider then joins with the first rider and so on to the fourth, until you get to the culmination in verse 8. Revelation 6 and verse 8. Notice what it says there. So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, the fourth horseman. And on the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him, and power was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with the sword. Okay, that's the second horseman. With hunger, that's famine. That's the third horseman. And then with death is the fourth horseman, this pale horse. And then it adds in the beasts of the field, and as we'll see later, even earthquakes. So what we have here, though, is that through these horsemen, a fourth of the earth will be impacted. Okay, now we're not talking about the physical coverage of the earth, because what is it? 3/4 of the earth is covered by water. And so that makes it somewhat inconsequential in terms of these actual horsemen having an effect on the actual earth in terms of a fourth of the coverage. So to me, this really points to the number of people. And we look at the number of people currently on the earth, it's just below 8 billion people. So a fourth of the earth being impacted by these horsemen would then translate into 2 billion people. Now, believe it or not, brethren, we live in somewhat relatively good times, calm times. If you go back over the history of, say, war, and you look at what's happened just in this century alone, there's not much that has gone on between the world powers in terms of these devastating type of wars that take its toll. The last time we have something like that goes back to World War II. So that's almost 80 years ago. You'd have to be 80 years old to even remember anything like this. And during that time, it was a devastating time of war. And even though it was a world war and it was very bad, only about 2.6% of the population was killed. Of course, don't get me wrong. Every single life has value, and nobody wants to see anyone die, especially, yourself. So, but the point is, this affected 2.6% of the people. If we look at, say, famine today, surprisingly, famine is almost non-existent for one reason or the other, whether it's through aid or whether it's through technology or education. It's almost virtually non-existent. And then if we look at disease, of the top 10 diseases, 7 of them are not even communicable. They're not passed on in the way that I think it's going to be in the end time in terms of pestilence and disease. Most of them are like heart disease, diabetes, and so on. Now, the communicable ones, they have some lower respiratory disease, is one of the most, I guess it's the most prevalent of the quote unquote top 10 diseases going on. And that's things like bronchitis and pneumonia. And so that's what's being tallied as the 10 worst diseases that are going on. And again, the point is that only 3 of them are even communicable. And so the total, though, of even those 10 is a small blip on the map. So when we look at what has happened or what is going on even right now with the coronavirus, with a possibility of a 2% mortality rate, and you combine that with the fact that there's not much going on in terms of war or famine, what we see then is that we are not in the time of the very end. Now, of course, these things have been going on since, I was young, since, again, those who saw World War II were young. And so the question is, what is it then going to, what is it we're seeing and what's going to happen in the future? So when we look at this and we see the wars, the famines, the disease happening, then we're going, okay, well, how do we then compare that with what's going to happen in the end? Because these things are indeed happening. And so what we see, though, is that it's going to increase in intensity. So these numbers of 2% we're going to long for, we're going to hope that that's what was going on. The 2% is going to be a thing of the way far distant past. We're going to then see this 1/4 of the earth actually come under these 4 seals, under the devastation that these 4 seals will bring. And so the time that we're looking at right now, it cannot be, just based on these scriptures, the time of the very end. In Matthew 24, which parallels, a lot of it parallels Revelation 6, it's Christ's Olivet prophecy. And in there, he summarizes what is going on or what's going to happen in the end. And that's how we actually know that the 4th, because it's not very clear, the 4th horseman, it talks about death, but in Matthew 24, it talks about it being the pestilence or the disease that's to come. But the point that we're noting here in Matthew 24 is that these things will happen, and then that's the beginning of sorrows. So we have all the 4 horsemen, and then Christ says this is just the beginning of sorrows. Because after that, you have the 5th seal, which is the Great Tribulation, the 6th, the heavenly signs, and the 7th, the day of the Lord. That's going to compound it and going to make even a lot of that pale in comparison. So it's the beginning of sorrows. So then what's our takeaway then from the coronavirus and what's going on right now? To me, I look at it as a dry run, as an attention getter to those who have the ears to hear and the eyes to see, that whenever we look at this, and this is just the smallest little inclination of what is to yet come, then I think the words that Peter had to say should resonate in our ears. And he was talking about all the devastation that's going to finally end up, and it's going to become, the very end of even the whole earth and heavens and everything. He says, what manner of persons should we be in terms of holy conduct? So we look at these things, okay, and it's coming upon the world, but it doesn't have to come upon us if we follow the word of God.